So let's take a look at Trestles and the mechanics of it and how those mechanics were changed more than 100 years ago. The first thing you have to know about Trestles is it sits at the bottom of a very large watershed. The San Mateo watershed is roughly 150 square miles. It has numerous tributaries, primarily the Cristianitos and San Mateo creeks. Up the floodplain where those two creeks connect is where the Hokaman Native Americans placed their village called Panhe, which is just a bit further inland than today's San Mateo campground. Now, from above their village, looking towards the ocean, you could see the full scope of the ancient floodplain. And when you spin around and get a closer look, you could see that the very southern end of the floodplain, the ancient floodplain, was south of Lowers. The northern end was up north of Uppers. Historically, the San Mateo Creek would meander all over this floodplain, but lower Trestles is what's called its relic delta. That's where its most common outlet was. Today, however, that's no longer the case. In fact, if you look close, you could see that the entire southern end of the floodplain has been dammed. It's easy to see it today if you're going up the trail by Lowers. You could see all the grading done for the numerous roads built through the watershed through the decades. But those were not the start. The first damming happened very long ago, around 1891. That's when the first railroad line got put in place through the region. And it just so happened that the railroad engineers were coming through after a huge winter storm. A storm that moved all the river mouths to the northern end of their floodplains. And when they reached Trestles and the San Mateo Creek, they locked the creek in place exactly where they found it. This changed Trestles forever, because from that point on, over the past century, Uppers has been the premier recipient of every major deposit. So now let's take a look at some that we know about. This first one is from 1932. It is the earliest photo we have of the region. This deposit is massive. Look at all that sediment. Photos from the very next year show you what happened to all that sand that got dumped at Uppers. Not only is it being pushed towards the beach, but it's also being pushed down the coast. And if you look here, in 1933, the left that everybody said didn't arrive until the 80s was already working at Lowers. This photo was taken about 4 decades after the railroad was put in. And you could see that the floodplain, especially the southern end of the floodplain, is adapting to its new reality. There's still a big marsh down on the southern end, and water is still flowing there, but it's being diverted north. Now, the aerial photos from 1969, which were an El Nino year, are some of the most amazing we have, because this was a massive deposit. You could see at Upper Trestles there, the sandbar was more than 700 feet offshore, completely dry. But you could see the very next year what happens to the sand there. In 1970, it was pushed in, and again, moving south. In the 90s, we saw a similar phenomenon with that El Nino. This one's nice and full color, and look at this. Another dry sandbar way out there. Anybody who remembers that year remembers it fondly. And the next year, we see the sand is pushed in, and once again, moving south, feeding the point at Lowers. The legacy of this railroad is pretty significant, because if you travel south from Trestles to Ponto, Cardiff, all those areas, the railroad tracks and the railroad bridges, for the most part, are still on the northern end of the floodplains in those areas. So those beaches and those ways were also shaped in some way, shape, or form by the hands of man.